This week's Bible study is on Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 to 9. Please read through the passage before you watch the video. This passage seems rather enigmatic and doesn't appear to particularly relate to the preceding verses in the chapter. We don't know who is speaking here, but whoever it is, they are expressing a profound trust and confidence in God. This text has been designated as the third servant song, meaning that it refers to a specially designated servant of God. You're perhaps more familiar with the fourth servant song, which is in Isaiah 52, verse 13, on to chapter 53, verse 12, which we particularly recall in Lent and most specifically in the events of Good Friday. However, the idea of today's passage as the third servant song doesn't help a great deal in our understanding of the passage itself. We can see that the speaker here is showing deep faith in God in a situation of exposure and vulnerability. One of the things that perhaps stands out here is the repeated use of the phrase, "the Lord God." This occurs 4 times as the speaker asserts their trust in God in the midst of their personal suffering. In verse 4, the speaker identifies as a learner and a listener. And it is to the Lord God that the speaker willingly and completely submits. The speaker is fully devoted to God and completely responsive to God's teaching and instruction. He has learned to be a willing listener. This means that he's been given words not just of instruction, but of identity too. In listening to God, the speaker understands that he fully belongs to God. And God teaches him how to give hope and life to the weary. In this context, this probably means to the people in exile. This resonates with Isaiah chapter 40, verses 28 to 31, which has a lot to say to those who are weary. The first part of verses 5 to 6 continues in the same vein as verse 4. The one speaking has open ears and is fully committed to God. He's not rebellious or half-hearted, but has totally devoted himself to living in God's way. But then the second part of verse 5 and verse 6 go off in an unusual direction. It becomes clear that being taught by God how to listen and then how to offer sustenance and encouragement to others is a risky business. It's an unpopular task. It goes against the grain. We don't know why it's so dangerous. We could wonder if perhaps comforting the exiles gives them a renewed sense of their identity as God's people, and therefore makes them less submissive and compliant to the occupying forces? Or does the danger to the speaker come from his own? We don't really know at all. Whatever the reason, and wherever it comes from, the speaker gets a huge amount of abuse. What the Lord God has told him to say is not popular. These 2 verses are typical of a prayer of complaint, outlining the trouble of persecution and stating innocence. In spite of all this abuse, the speaker has not given up. He has withstood all this pressure in order to keep on saying what the Lord God has asked him to say. And this leads us to verses 7 and 8. Despite the huge amount of trouble, the speaker knows he's not alone because the same Lord God who gave him his initial instructions is there to help him now, with powerful support. Being obedient to God may have led the speaker into conflict and abuse, but God stands by him. These verses sound almost defiantly confident. Verse 8 turns to the language of the law courts. We may read this as showing the speaker being taken to court, perhaps to be accused of treason or subverting public order. But he's not afraid or intimidated because he knows that God will vindicate him and declare him innocent. Verse 9 gives us the 4th use of the phrase, "the Lord God," and it follows on from the thought of verses 7 and 8. The word condemn or declare guilty partners the word vindicate from verse 8. In a law court, there are 2 options, vindicate or condemn. And because God has already vindicated the speaker, those who would bring about the second action, those who would condemn him, are already themselves condemned. They're helpless to harm the defendant, and in fact they will use up their energy in a pointless court case and will be exhausted like an old garment that is eaten up by a moth. This passage is really hard to grapple with, partly because we don't have many contextual clues to help us in interpretation. Because it is set by the lectionary for this Sunday at the start of Holy Week, we often read it as referring to Jesus in his passion. We see Jesus as the faithful one, completely obedient even to death, and fully honoured by God's gracious and merciful activity. And perhaps we can see in our own experience the drama of dangerous obedience to God. This poem is spoken by one who is so sure of his vocation that he will not be put off. He knows that however much trouble he gets into, he will withstand it, because God is there and God helps. If you'd like to reflect further on this passage, there are some questions you might like to consider. First of all, read through the passage again and take note of any words or phrases that jump out at you. How do you respond to the idea that being truly faithful to God leads you inevitably into conflict and suffering? Think of any occasions when you have experienced trouble because you have tried to do what you believe God was asking of you. How have you found strength to cope at such times? Read through the passage again and imagine that Jesus is the speaker. How does this make you feel as we approach Holy Week? Focus on the repeated phrase, "The Lord God helps me." Can you point to any specific examples in the last few weeks where you have experienced God's help? Try to call this phrase to mind no matter what you're doing in the days ahead. How does it feel to understand that God is present and helping you in all your daily tasks, and not just in times of trouble? Offer to God any situations in which you feel that you especially need God's help today.